On November 24th, 1326, a vast crowd gathered in England, all eager to witness the brutal execution of one unfortunate man. A man who had once been the favorite of King Edward, now publicly castrated and disemboweled in front of the entire city. As he met his gruesome end, the mockery of his masculinity echoed through the streets, a symbol of his total fall from grace. The people, both commoners and nobles alike, stood in grim silence, knowing that today they would witness an execution that would echo through history. Despenser's rise began in the late 1310s, when he first entered Edward II's favor. His early successes were not in 187 warfare, but in the delicate art of court politics, winning the king's trust and favor, which would prove to be the cornerstone of his power. Through strategic alliances, both within the royal family and among influential barons, Hugh established himself as one of the king's most trusted advisors. Edward, drawn to Despenser's charisma and loyalty, showered him with lands and titles, granting him control over vast estates. As the years passed, Despenser's influence over the king deepened, while Edward II focused on personal matters, particularly his close relationship with his favorites. Hugh Dispenser became the king's right hand, a silent force behind the throne. But in this period of growing influence, Hugh made one fatal mistake, the same mistake that had brought down countless men before him. He became too powerful, too arrogant. His control over lands, wealth, and even key political decisions became an open threat to the traditional aristocracy. The nobility, already disgruntled by the king's lack of authority, could no longer tolerate the unchecked power of Hugh Dispenser. But as Hugh Despenser's influence grew, so too did the simmering discontent that brewed beneath the surface of Edward II's court. The greatest force against Hugh came from the Queen, Isabella of France. In the early years of her marriage to Edward II, Isabella had endured a marriage fraught with neglect and political manipulation. Edward's affections, it seemed, lay more with his male favorites than with his queen. Over time, Queen Isabella's frustration grew. Her position at court had become untenable, as she found herself constantly undermined by the king's reliance on his favorites. The queen found a willing ally in Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who, too, had suffered at Hugh's hands. Mortimer had been imprisoned by Despenser after a failed rebellion, and he carried a burning desire for revenge. Together, Isabella and Mortimer formed a secret alliance, united by their shared ambition to rid England of Hugh's grasp on the throne. Despenser, for all his cunning and mastery over Edward, had underestimated the power of those united by a common cause. The king's weakness, his indecision, was the fuel that stoked the fires of opposition. With every passing year, the pressure on Hugh mounted, but his confidence in his position blinded him to the looming storm. Despenser's enemies were not content to wait for a decisive military strike. They knew that the king's weakness was his greatest vulnerability. The Queen and Mortimer carefully stoked the flames of rebellion, feeding Edward's doubts and insecurities. What had once been a quiet resentment was now a full-blown conflict. Hugh, ever the manipulator, tried to hold the line, using his influence over Edward to keep the opposition at bay. But his power had peaked, and the tide was turning. The king's most trusted advisor had become his greatest liability. Despenser's unyielding grasp on power had alienated too many, and now, with the combined forces of Isabella, Mortimer, and the barons closing in, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and with it, the fall of Hugh Dispenser was all but certain. The final chapter of Hugh Despenser's life would be as brutal as it was public. His capture, swift as it was, only marked the beginning of his suffering. After a trial that offered him no defense, no mercy, the fate that awaited him was one forged not in the courtrooms of Westminster, but in the streets of London. It was on the cold morning of November 24, 1326, that Hugh Dispenser was led from the confines of his prison cell to the scaffold. The air was thick with the tension of the crowd which had gathered at Tyburn Hill. a place already notorious for executions. Hugh was not led to the scaffold as a king's favorite, nor as a man of wealth and power. He was led there shackled, a broken figure, disheveled and humiliated. Once a symbol of the king's trust, now he was nothing more than a condemned criminal. His wealth and power stripped away, his life hanging by the slenderest of threads. First, Hugh Dispenser was hanged. The noose, tight around his neck, was meant to be quick, but it was only the beginning of the torture he would endure. As his body dangled from the rope, lifeless for a brief moment, the executioners wasted no time. They cut him down, his body still limp from the hanging. With the crowd looking on in horror, they began the next stage of his punishment. In an act that would shock even the most hardened of onlookers, the executioners began to castrate Hugh Despenser. This was no ordinary punishment. It was a brutal, symbolic act, a stripping of his very identity as a man. The castration was carried out with surgical precision, but in such a public and cruel manner that it became an undeniable spectacle of suffering. As the executioners performed the gruesome act, the crowd stood in silent awe, witnessing the barbaric ritual unfold before their eyes. It was not just the physical pain that Hugh must have endured, it was the humiliation, the absolute stripping of his dignity. To be castrated in public, to have his very masculinity torn away in front of all, was to be reduced to nothing more than an object of scorn. But the brutality did not end there. After the castration, Hugh's mutilated body was further desecrated. His internal organs were removed and displayed for all to see. This disemboweling was a symbolic act meant to represent not only the destruction of Hugh's physical being, but also the utter eradication of his power, his legacy, and his future. The final step in this cruel spectacle was perhaps the most horrific of all. Hugh Despenser's severed body parts were paraded through the streets of London, publicly displayed as a final act of disgrace. His severed head was placed on a pike, a grim trophy for all to see, while his mutilated corpse was left to be ogled by the throngs of people who had gathered to witness the event. It was a death more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. It was a punishment designed not just to kill a man, but to utterly erase him from memory. Hugh Dispenser, once one of the most powerful men in England, was reduced to a mere symbol of excess, of greed, and of the consequences of abusing power. His body, broken and desecrated, lay in the streets as a grim reminder of what happened to those who reached too far. The brutality of his execution left a mark not just on the pages of history, but on the minds of the people. It was a spectacle of violence that would haunt the kingdom for generations, a dark chapter in the reign of Edward II, and a chilling warning to anyone who would dare to rise above their station. The streets of London fell silent as the final remnants of Hugh Despenser's body were removed, but the reverberations of his death would echo throughout England for years to come. His execution was not just a brutal punishment for one man. It was a message to all those who might seek to gain too much power, to rise too high above their station. It was a warning to the nobles, to the ambitious, and to anyone who dared challenge the delicate balance of power in the kingdom. The immediate aftermath of Despenser's death was marked by a chilling sense of finality. His once loyal followers, scattered across England, were left without a leader, their support for the king's favorite now meaningless in the face of the Queen's and Mortimer's dominance. His lands and titles were swiftly seized, redistributed among those who had backed Isabella's revolt. It was a bitter irony. Those very estates that had once granted Hugh immense power were now in the hands of his enemies, as though his very rise had been reversed in a single stroke. For King Edward II, the death of his most trusted ally marked the beginning of his own tragic downfall. Despenser's execution was not just a loss of power, it was a direct challenge to Edward's authority. Hugh Dispenser's death was not merely the end of his life, but the culmination of a deeply symbolic moment in English history. The brutality of his execution, particularly the act of public castration, carried meanings far beyond its immediate horror. It was a spectacle that seemed to strip away not just his physical being, but the very idea of power that he had come to represent. Thus, Despenser's execution was a turning point in English history, a moment when the very nature of royal power was questioned and disrupted. His rise had been the product of a fractured kingdom, and his fall was a sign of the winds of change sweeping through the monarchy. In the end, the symbolic nature of his death left an indelible mark, not only on those who lived through it, but on the course of English history itself.